My name is Blanche, 62 years old, and I just buried my husband of 40 years. My son Andrew convinced me that living in our remote family estate would help me heal. I trusted him. This morning he dropped me off and drove away. No phone service, no internet, no neighbors, no car, just silence, trees, and a house full of memories that aren't even mine. I'm completely alone now. If you're watching this video, please let me know where you're from in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow my journey from abandonment to discovery. You won't believe what I found in this house. The day I met Gerald still feels like yesterday, though it happened over 40 years ago. We bumped into each other at a coffee shop in downtown Boston. He spilled his coffee all over my art portfolio. Instead of being angry, I laughed at his mortified expression, and he asked me to dinner to make up for it. 6 months later, we were married. Our life in Boston had been everything I could have dreamed of. Gerald built a successful career as a corporate attorney, while I taught art at the local high school. We lived in a beautiful brownstone with big windows that let in streams of sunlight perfect for my weekend painting sessions. Every Sunday morning, Gerald would bring me coffee in bed, and we'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing. Our neighborhood was vibrant, full of friendly faces and familiar routines. Mrs. Patterson from next door would bring over her famous apple pie every fall. The local bookstore owner, Tom, always saved new art books for me. After I retired from teaching 5 years ago, I filled my days with community art programs and lunches with friends. Gerald talked about retirement too, but he loved his work too much to leave it behind entirely. He cut back his hours instead, and we traveled more. Paris in the spring, Italy in the fall. We were planning a trip to Japan when everything changed. Our son Andrew was the light of our lives. From the moment he was born, Gerald doted on him. They were so alike. The same analytical mind, the same quiet determination, the same dimple in their right cheek when they smiled. As a child, Andrew would sit in Gerald's home office for hours watching him work. Gerald taught him to play chess, to argue both sides of any issue, to stand up straight and look people in the eye. I taught him to see beauty in unexpected places, to be kind, to express his feelings. At least I tried. Things changed when Andrew met Jessica in college. She was ambitious, focused entirely on building a career in finance. There was nothing wrong with that, but she always seemed to look through me when we spoke, as if I were transparent or somehow less substantial than other people. After they married, their visits became less frequent, their calls shorter. Gerald never complained, but I saw the hurt in his eyes whenever Andrew canceled plans last minute or forgot his father's birthday. The distance between us grew wider after they bought their house in Connecticut. Suddenly, Boston was too far to drive for Sunday dinner. Holidays became brief, tense affairs with Jessica checking her watch and Andrew glancing at his phone. Gerald tried to bridge the gap, sending thoughtful gifts and leaving cheerful voicemails, but the effort was increasingly one-sided. Then came the diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctor spoke in gentle tones about treatment options and quality of life, but the message was clear. Gerald had months, not years. He faced it with the same steadfast courage he'd shown throughout his life. I fell apart. He held me together. The treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy ravaged his strong body, turning him frail and hollow-eyed. Still, he insisted on keeping up appearances. He wore his good suits to every appointment, refused a wheelchair, even when walking became excruciating. At night, when he thought I was asleep, I would hear him crying quietly in the bathroom, allowing himself the privacy to face his fear and pain. We called Andrew immediately after the diagnosis. He sounded shocked, promised to visit that weekend. He and Jessica arrived late Friday evening and left Saturday afternoon, citing a work emergency. Gerald said he understood. I saw it for what it was. In his final weeks, Gerald's lucidity came and went. During a clear moment, he made me promise to live fully after he was gone. I agreed, never telling him that I couldn't imagine a life without him in it. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, holding my hand, the weak autumn sunlight painting gold across his face. The funeral was small and dignified, just as Gerald would have wanted. Andrew and Jessica stayed at a hotel, despite our guest room standing ready. They left immediately after the service, Andrew muttering vague promises about coming back to help me sort through things. I stood in our empty house that night, surrounded by Gerald's books, his collection of vintage fountain pens, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in our closet, and felt the full weight of solitude crash down upon me. The weeks that followed passed in a fog. I went through the motions of living. Neighbors brought casseroles I couldn't eat. Friends called and visited, their concern genuine, but unable to penetrate my grief. I started sorting through Gerald's belongings and stopped, unable to decide what to keep and what to let go. Every item held memories. How could I part with any of it? Andrew called every Sunday, brief conversations filled with awkward pauses. He asked practical questions about insurance and accounts, but never how I was really doing. I didn't tell him about waking up reaching for Gerald, or how I still set two places at the table sometimes before catching myself. I didn't mention the crushing loneliness of evenings in our too large house. I pretended I was fine. He pretended to believe me. 3 months after Gerald's death, I was still sleepwalking through my days when Andrew showed up unannounced on a Saturday morning. He looked uncomfortable on my sofa, declining coffee, his eyes darting around the living room as if cataloging items of value. "Mom, Jessica and I have been talking," he said, his tone carefully measured. "We're worried about you being alone in this big house." I began to protest that I was managing, but he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Dad bought a property years ago out in Montana. It's been sitting empty, but it's fully furnished. Beautiful place, really peaceful, surrounded by nature." I frowned, trying to recall Gerald ever mentioning such a property. "Your father never told me about a house in Montana." Andrew waved his hand dismissively. "It was an investment. He mentioned possibly retiring there someday. Anyway, we think it would be good for you. Clean air, beautiful scenery, a chance to heal away from all these reminders." The idea of leaving my home, my friends, my entire support system seemed absurd. "Andrew, my life is here. I can't just leave." His expression hardened slightly. "Mom, this house is too big for one person. The property taxes are outrageous. The maintenance alone will eat through your savings. Dad would want you to be practical." The invocation of what Gerald would want felt manipulative, but there was also a kernel of truth to it. Our savings had taken a hit with the medical bills. I had been avoiding looking at the financial picture too closely. "You could sell this place, invest the money, live comfortably," Andrew continued. "The Montana property is paid for. No mortgage, minimal property taxes because it's rural." "And what about my friends, my doctor, the life I've built here?" Andrew leaned forward, his expression softening in a way that reminded me painfully of Gerald. "It would just be temporary, Mom. A few months to clear your head. If you hate it, you come back. In the meantime, it gives you space to decide what you really want without rushing." I remained skeptical, but Andrew spent the next hour painting a picture of a charming country retreat. A cozy house with a fireplace, wildlife outside the windows, stars brighter than I'd ever seen, peace and quiet to process my grief. He promised regular visits, said he'd help me get everything set up with phone and internet. "Just think about it," he said before leaving. "Jessica and I only want what's best for you." That night I couldn't sleep. Our bedroom felt haunted by Gerald's absence. I wandered the house, touching familiar objects, wondering if Andrew might be right. Perhaps I did need a change of scenery to break the pattern of grief I'd fallen into. Perhaps somewhere new I could find a way to honor my promise to Gerald, to live fully again. The next morning I called Andrew and agreed to his plan. His relief was palpable through the phone. He suggested we move quickly before I could change my mind. Within a week, I had contacted a real estate agent to discuss listing the house. I began the painful process of deciding what to keep, what to store, what to give away. Friends expressed concern about my sudden decision, but I assured them it was temporary, a chance to clear my head. The preparation happened so quickly, I barely had time to process it. Andrew arranged everything from the moving company to put most of my belongings in storage to the plane tickets to Montana. I had to fight to bring more than 2 suitcases of personal items, Andrew insisting that the house was already furnished and I wouldn't need much. The day of departure arrived with jarring finality. Saying goodbye to my book club, my next-door neighbors, My favorite coffee shop. Andrew picked me up early, impatient with my tearful farewells. The flight was long, my stomach knotted with anxiety. Andrew spent most of it on his laptop, occasionally answering work calls, barely speaking to me. We landed in Bozeman, then drove for what seemed like forever, through increasingly remote landscapes. I tried to appreciate the majesty of the mountains, the expansive sky, but my nerves made it difficult to focus. As we turned onto progressively smaller roads, leaving even tiny towns behind, a sense of unease began to grow within me. "How far are we from the nearest neighbor?" I asked, as we bumped down what was little more than a dirt track. "There's plenty of space out here," Andrew replied vaguely. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Peace and quiet." Finally, after nearly 3 hours of driving from the airport, we turned onto a narrow driveway nearly hidden by overgrown bushes. At the end stood a 2-story farmhouse that had clearly seen better days. Paint peeled from the clapboard shutters hung askew. The front porch sagged slightly. Nothing like the charming country retreat Andrew had described. "It has character," Andrew said quickly, noting my expression. "Just needs some TLC. The inside is much better." It wasn't. The furniture was outdated and musty. A fine layer of dust covered every surface. The kitchen appliances looked to be from the 1970s. Upstairs, the main bedroom had a sagging mattress and faded curtains that did little to block the light. The bathroom featured avocado green fixtures and temperamental plumbing. "When was the last time anyone stayed here?" I asked, trying to keep accusation from my voice. "It's been a while," Andrew admitted, busying himself with bringing in my suitcases. "But everything works. Electricity, water, heat, the essentials." I opened my mouth to ask about phone and internet, the things he'd promised to set up, but he was already launching into a quick tour. The kitchen with its ancient refrigerator stocked with just enough basics to last a week, maybe 2. The living room with a TV that only played DVDs. The back door that stuck unless you lifted it while turning the handle. "There's a generator in the shed out back if the power goes out," he explained hurriedly. "And the woodpile should last until spring if you're careful with it." Every sentence made it clearer that this was not a temporary visit, but an indefinite stay. Still, I tried to remain optimistic, to see it as an adventure rather than abandonment. "What about internet cell service? You said you'd arrange that." I finally managed to ask as Andrew checked his watch for the 3rd time. He grimaced. "Cell reception is spotty out here. Best place to get a signal is on the hill behind the house. As for internet, the local provider is coming next week to set it up." He didn't meet my eyes as he said it. "And how will I get around to buy groceries or see a doctor if I need to?" Andrew gestured toward an ancient pickup truck parked beside the house. "That old thing still runs. Keys are in the kitchen drawer. Town's about 20 miles east." Before I could ask any more questions or voice my growing concerns, Andrew glanced at his phone and announced he needed to get back on the road to make his return flight. He gave me a quick, awkward hug, promised to call soon, and was gone in a cloud of dust before I could fully process what was happening. I stood on the sagging porch, watching the road long after his rental car had disappeared, the setting sun casting long shadows across unfamiliar land. Only then did I allow myself to cry. The next morning, I woke disoriented in the unfamiliar bedroom. For a brief moment, I thought the past months had been a nightmare, but reality crashed back as I took in the faded wallpaper and drafty windows. Gerald was gone. And now I was alone in the middle of nowhere. I made a cup of instant coffee, grimacing at the taste, and took stock of my situation. The refrigerator contained some eggs, bread, milk, a few apples, and basic condiments. The pantry held several cans of soup, beans, and tuna, along with rice pasta and instant oatmeal. Looking at the supplies critically, I estimated they would last 2 weeks at most. I tried the landline phone, surprised to find it actually worked, only to discover it was limited to local calls. When I tried dialing Andrew's cell number, an automated message informed me that long-distance service was not included in this line. My own cell phone showed no service inside the house. Following Andrew's advice, I hiked up the small hill behind the property. After trying various spots, I finally found a location where one bar of service appeared. I immediately called Andrew. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me back, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. I spent the rest of that first day exploring the house and immediate grounds. The property was larger than I'd initially realized, with several acres of overgrown fields surrounding the house. A dilapidated barn stood about 100 yards away, and beyond that, dense forest stretched as far as I could see. It might have been beautiful if it hadn't felt so isolating. Inside the house, I discovered more concerning details. The hot water heater worked only sporadically. Several windows didn't lock properly. The upstairs bathroom sink leaked steadily into a bucket someone had placed beneath it. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were signs of long-term neglect. In the kitchen, I found a drawer containing various papers related to the house: property tax statements, utility bills, a hand-drawn map of the grounds. As I sorted through them, I noticed something odd. The most recent documents were addressed to Andrew, not Gerald. Frowning, I dug deeper and found a deed to the property with Andrew's name, as the owner dated 3 years prior. That didn't make sense. Gerald had never mentioned transferring property to Andrew. If this house had been in our family, why was I only hearing about it now? And why was Andrew's name on the deed instead of Gerald's? I continued searching and found a folder containing correspondence between Andrew and a real estate development company called North Star Properties. The letters referenced acquisition of surrounding parcels and zoning adjustments for the resort development project. The most recent letter, dated just weeks after Gerald's funeral, mentioned resolving the final occupancy issue before proceeding. My hands shook as I put the pieces together. This wasn't about giving me a peaceful place to grieve. This was about getting me out of our Boston home so it could be sold quickly. And this property wasn't a family retreat, but some kind of investment Andrew had made without our knowledge, likely part of a larger development deal. The final occupancy issue had to be me. I was the complication in whatever plan Andrew and Jessica had concocted. My presence in Boston was inconvenient, so they had effectively exiled me to this forgotten corner of Montana. Anger and hurt warred within me. How could my own son do this? What happened to the boy Gerald and I had raised? The betrayal felt almost as painful as losing Gerald. I retreated to the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching darkness fall over the unfamiliar landscape. In Boston, evenings meant streetlights, neighbors, walking dogs, the comfortable sounds of urban life. Here the darkness was absolute, the silence broken only by the call of unfamiliar birds and the whisper of wind through trees. When I went back inside to make dinner, I discovered another unpleasant surprise. The ancient pickup truck Andrew had indicated was for my use had no keys in the kitchen drawer as promised. I searched every drawer, every likely hiding place in the house. Nothing. Without transportation, I was completely stranded. That night I tried Andrew's cell phone again from the hill, leaving a message more direct than the first. The truck has no keys. There's barely any food. Please call me back immediately. My voice cracked on the last word. Days passed with no return call. I rationed the food carefully, making mental calculations about how long I could survive on what was available. I tried the truck's ignition, hoping Andrew had simply been mistaken about the keys, only to find that not only was there no key, but the wiring under the dash had been removed. The truck was deliberately disabled. 1 week after being left at the house, I made a desperate attempt to walk to the nearest town. I packed a small bag with water and one of my remaining apples, used the hand-drawn map to orient myself, and set out at dawn. After 3 hours of walking along unmarked roads with no sign of civilization and no cell service, I reluctantly turned back, afraid of being stranded after dark. The realization settled over me like a physical weight. I wasn't just inconvenienced, I was imprisoned. My son had abandoned me in a remote location with inadequate supplies and no means of escape. The question was, why? What was so important about this property that he would go to such lengths? As my second week in isolation began, a fierce storm blew in. Rain pounded the roof, wind howled through the poorly sealed windows, and the electricity flickered ominously before dying completely. In the sudden darkness, I fumbled for the flashlight I'd found in a kitchen drawer. With the power out, the house grew cold quickly. I managed to light the wood stove in the living room, grateful for the small comfort of its warmth. As I huddled near it with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, I heard a strange sound from somewhere above me. A thump, followed by a scraping noise. My heart raced. Was someone in the house? Had Andrew returned? Or was it something worse? The noises continued rhythmic now, like something moving across the attic floor. Armed with only the flashlight and my own determination, I climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor. At the end of the hallway stood a door I hadn't fully explored, assuming it was just a closet. The sounds were definitely coming from behind it. I approached cautiously, flashlight beam trembling slightly with my unsteady hand. The door was latched, but not locked. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and pulled it open. Instead of a closet, I found a steep staircase leading to what had to be an attic. The thumping sound grew louder. Something was definitely up there. Common sense told me to close the door and barricade myself in the bedroom until morning. Curiosity and desperation pushed me forward. If there was an intruder, I needed to know. If it was just an animal seeking shelter from the storm, I needed to secure the house. The attic stairs creaked beneath my weight as I climbed slowly upward. The beam of my flashlight cut through thick darkness, illuminating rafters hung with cobwebs and a floor cluttered with old trunks and furniture draped in sheets. The storm sounded fiercer up here, rain drumming directly overhead. The noise had stopped when I entered, but as I swept my flashlight across the space, I caught a glimpse of movement near an old wardrobe in the corner. Heart pounding, I moved toward it. The wardrobe was enormous, carved from dark wood that had faded with age. One door hung slightly ajar, moving gently in the draft from a small attic window. I pulled it open fully, expecting perhaps a raccoon or squirrel that had found its way inside. Instead, I found another door, small and unobtrusive, built into the back of the wardrobe itself. As I stared at it in confusion, it shifted slightly, causing the scraping sound I'd heard from below. With shaking hands, I reached for the tiny brass knob. The hidden door swung outward at my touch. I raised my flashlight to peer inside and screamed at what I saw. I screamed not from fear, but from shock. Inside the hidden compartment was no monster or intruder, but a small room packed with treasures. Stacks of old leather-bound books, wooden boxes filled with jewelry, bundles of cash wrapped in faded rubber bands, photographs in silver frames, and hanging on the wall, an oil portrait of a woman who looked startlingly like me. I stepped into the secret room, my flashlight beam bouncing off glittering objects. A vanity table stood against one wall, its surface covered with old perfume bottles and a silver hairbrush set. A small desk beside it held stacks of papers and a leather journal with the name Margaret embossed on the cover. Margaret. Gerald had mentioned his mother's name was Margaret, though he rarely spoke of her. She had died when he was young, and his father had raised him alone. At least that was the story I'd been told. I picked up the journal with reverent hands, sensing I was about to uncover secrets long buried. Settling onto a small velvet chair, I opened it to the first page and began to read by flashlight. June 15, 1962. Henry brought me to this house today. He calls it a summer retreat, but I know what it really is. A prison disguised as a gift. I've seen the way the mining company representatives look at our land. I've heard the rumors about what lies beneath it. Henry thinks I don't know, but I've always been more observant than he gives me credit for. Now that I've refused to sign the mineral rights over to his company, this is his solution. Keep me here away from lawyers and friends until I acquiesce or go mad from loneliness. He doesn't realize I've already taken precautions. The documents are hidden where he'll never find them. And I've begun my own collection, a legacy for my son, if anything should happen to me. I read entry after entry, the storm forgotten, as Margaret's story unfolded. She had discovered a small deposit of sapphires on the property, valuable enough to attract attention from mining interests. Her husband, Henry, had wanted to sell the rights for a fraction of their worth to a company he secretly held shares in. When she refused, he isolated her here, telling their young son Gerald that his mother needed rest in the country. Over the years, Margaret had secretly collected evidence of Henry's underhanded business dealings. She'd also been squirreling away valuables, cash, and documents in this hidden room, preparing for an escape that never came. The final entry was dated October 1965, just a brief note. I don't feel well today. The headaches are worse. If I don't make it, Gerald, know that I loved you more than anything in this world. Everything here is yours. Use it wisely. There were no more entries after that. Margaret had died from an aneurysm shortly after, according to what Gerald had told me. But had he known the truth about his mother's isolation? Had he ever found this room and the legacy she left him? As I continued exploring the hidden space, I found more recent documents mixed among Margaret's papers. Geological surveys of the property and surrounding area from just 5 years ago, confirming the presence of sapphires and estimating their value at several $1,000,000. A letter from North Star Properties to Henry Lawson, dated 1970, expressing condolences on Margaret's passing and reiterating interest in the property. And most damning of all, a recent contract between Andrew and the same company, now called North Star Development Group, selling the entire property for $10 million, contingent on vacant possession, within 6 months of signing. The contract was dated 2 weeks before Gerald's death. My hands shook as I read it again. Had Andrew known about his grandmother's discovery? Had Gerald? How long had this plan been in motion? I set the papers aside and continued my exploration. In a small jewelry box, I found old photographs of Margaret, with a young boy who had to be Gerald. In one, they stood in front of this very house, Margaret's smile strained, but her arm protective around her son's shoulders. Gerald couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. On the desk lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, all addressed to Gerald, but never sent. I read them by flashlight as the storm raged outside, tears streaming down my face. Margaret's words to her son were full of love and longing explanations she never got to give him in person. In the last letter, she wrote of the sapphires, of his father's deception, of her hope that Gerald would someday understand and forgive her for not being strong enough to escape with him. I sat among Margaret's treasures until my flashlight began to dim, trying to process everything I'd discovered. Gerald had never mentioned this house or his mother's time here. Had he not known? Or had the memories been too painful to share? And how had Andrew discovered what his father apparently never had? As dawn broke and the storm finally subsided, I gathered the most important documents and brought them downstairs. The power remained out, but morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating the shabby living room in a new way. This house wasn't just an inconvenient property to be developed. It was the site of another woman's imprisonment, a story eerily parallel to my own situation. But unlike Margaret, I wouldn't remain a prisoner. With renewed determination, I spread the papers on the kitchen table and began formulating a plan. If Andrew wanted this property badly enough to abandon his own mother here, there had to be a way to use that desire as leverage. First, I needed to establish contact with the outside world. I remembered seeing an old ham radio in the barn during my initial exploration. With Margaret's journal and the documents tucked safely under my mattress, I set out across the muddy yard to see if the radio might still work. The barn was in worse shape than the house, its roof partially collapsed in one corner. I picked my way carefully through puddles and debris to where I'd spotted the radio equipment on a dusty workbench. It was old, but appeared intact. My father had been an amateur radio enthusiast, and I'd spent many childhood evenings watching him communicate with people across the country. I hoped those long-ago lessons would come back to me. After an hour of cleaning connections and figuring out the power source, I managed to get the radio humming with life. I adjusted dials, listening to static, searching for any human voice. Finally, I heard someone. A man's voice reciting what sounded like weather conditions. I pressed the transmitter button. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? This is an emergency call from Lawson Property in Madison County, Montana." Silence then. "This is Frank Wilson, Park Ranger Station 7. I read you. What's your emergency?" My voice broke with relief as I explained my situation, careful to stick to facts that wouldn't sound paranoid. Stranded without transportation at a remote property. Limited supplies. No way to reach town. Frank's response was immediate and reassuring. "I know that old Lawson place. I'll come by this afternoon once the roads dry out a bit. Can you hang tight until then?" I assured him I could and signed off, hope blossoming for the first time since arriving. Help was coming. But I needed more than just immediate rescue. I needed a longer-term solution. While waiting for Frank, I continued exploring the house with new purpose. In the basement, I found boxes of Margaret's belongings that hadn't made it to the hidden room. Photo albums, books, clothing. In one album, I discovered pictures of the property in its prime, with gardens and orchards now long overgrown. Most importantly, I found a detailed map of the property boundaries far more specific than the hand-drawn version upstairs. According to this map, the property encompassed nearly 500 acres, including a section of river and the hillside that, according to the geological surveys, contained the sapphire deposits. When Frank arrived that afternoon in his Forest Service truck, I was ready. I told him a simplified version of the truth that my son had left me here temporarily, but there seemed to be a misunderstanding about provisions and transportation. Frank, a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, immediately offered practical help. "Town's a fair piece away, but I can bring you supplies to tide you over. And there's a phone at the ranger station you can use for long-distance calls." He eyed me carefully. "Unless you'd prefer I just take you to town now, you could get a room at the motel until your son returns." I considered it briefly, but decided against leaving. "Actually, if you could help me with supplies and phone access, I'd appreciate it. There are some matters I need to sort out here first." Frank seemed to understand there was more to the story, but didn't pry. He promised to return the next day with groceries and offered to take me to the ranger station whenever I needed to make calls. Before leaving, he showed me how to use the generator properly and checked the wood stove to ensure it was safe. "Not many folks out this way," he commented as he prepared to leave. "Gets lonely. My station's about 7 miles north if you need anything urgent. Can't miss it only building on that ridge with the radio tower." With Frank's help, I gained not just physical necessities, but something equally valuable, a connection to the outside world. Over the next week, he drove me to the ranger station 3 times to use the phone. I called a locksmith in the nearest town who came and changed all the locks on the house. I contacted Gerald's former legal partner explaining the situation and sending copies of the documents I'd found via Frank's fax machine. Most importantly, I placed a call to North Star Development Group and asked to speak with Thomas Brennan, the executive whose signature appeared on the contract with Andrew. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, when he realized who was calling, surprise evident in his voice. "We were told you were living in Boston." "Circumstances change, Mr. Brennan," I replied calmly. "I'm currently residing at the Montana property, and I've recently discovered some interesting documents regarding its history and mineral rights." There was a long pause. "I see. Perhaps we should schedule a meeting to discuss this further." "I think that would be wise, and you might want to bring your legal team." While waiting for this meeting, I didn't remain idle. With Frank's occasional help and supplies, I began clearing out decades of neglect from the house. I uncovered furniture that, once cleaned, proved to be valuable antiques. I found Margaret's garden plans in her papers and began tentatively reclaiming a small plot near the kitchen door, planting seeds from packets Frank brought me. In the hidden room, I sorted through Margaret's possessions more thoroughly, organizing the documents chronologically and taking inventory of the jewelry and cash. Some pieces were quite valuable antique sapphire and diamond jewelry that Margaret had likely inherited. The cash, while old, still amounted to several $1,000s. Exploring the grounds with the detailed map as my guide, I located landmarks Margaret had noted, including the small stream where she'd first discovered sapphire traces. The property was larger and more varied than I'd initially realized, with meadows, woods, and dramatic views of distant mountains. On clear days, I could see why someone might find this place beautiful rather than isolating. When I wasn't working on the house or exploring, I read Margaret's journal and letters, thoroughly feeling a connection to this woman I'd never met. Like me, she'd been brought here against her will. Unlike me, she hadn't found a way out. I was determined not to share her fate. 3 weeks after my arrival, Frank delivered a message that Thomas Brennan and the North Star legal team would be visiting the property the following day. That same afternoon, I received a call at the ranger station from Andrew, the first contact since he'd left me. "Mom," he sounded annoyed. I just got a call from Tom Brennan saying you're interfering with a business transaction. What are you doing? I kept my voice steady. I'm protecting my interests, Andrew. Something you apparently thought I was too senile or grief-stricken to do. What are you talking about? I set you up in a nice, quiet place to recover. You should be thanking me. For abandoning me without adequate food or transportation, for planning to sell this property out from under me, for lying about your father's wishes. My voice shook slightly, but not from fear, from anger. You don't understand the complexities, he began, his tone patronizing. I cut him off. I understand perfectly well. I found Margaret's room, Andrew. I know about the sapphires. I know about your deal with North Star. I know everything. Silence stretched between us. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its condescending edge. What do you want? Come to the meeting tomorrow with Brennan. We'll discuss it then. The next morning, I dressed carefully in one of the few good outfits. I'd packed a navy blue dress that Gerald had always liked. I swept the main rooms, made coffee, and arranged Margaret's most damning documents on the kitchen table. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting calmly on the porch when two black SUVs approached up the drive. Thomas Brennan emerged from the first vehicle, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit incongruous against the rural backdrop. From the second came Andrew and Jessica, both looking tense. Behind them followed two people carrying briefcases who I assumed were attorneys. Mrs. Lawson, Brennan greeted me, extending his hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I shook his hand firmly. Please come inside. Andrew avoided my eyes as they all filed into the kitchen. Jessica looked around the shabby interior with thinly veiled disgust. I gestured for everyone to sit at the large farmhouse table. Coffee, I offered, playing the gracious hostess despite everything. Brennan accepted. The lawyers declined. Andrew and Jessica remained standing awkwardly near the door. I poured coffee for Brennan and myself, then took my place at the head of the table. I assume we're all here to discuss the future of this property? Yes, Brennan replied cautiously. There seems to be some confusion about ownership and development rights. I smiled thinly. No confusion, Mr. Brennan. Just deliberate deception. I turned to Andrew. Would you like to explain to Mr. Brennan how you came to sign over property that contains valuable mineral deposits without disclosing that fact? Or shall I? Andrew's face flushed. You don't know what you're talking about. I opened Margaret's journal to a marked page. Your grandmother discovered sapphires on this land in 1962. Your grandfather tried to force her to sign away the mineral rights. When she refused, he essentially imprisoned her here until her death. I slid the geological survey across the table to Brennan. This recent survey confirms those deposits are still viable and quite valuable. Jessica stepped forward. This is ridiculous. Some old woman's diary isn't legal evidence. I ignored her, focusing on Brennan. What you may not know, Mr. Brennan, is that Andrew never legally inherited this property. His name is on the deed because he forged documents after my husband's death. The lawyers exchanged glances. Brennan looked at Andrew sharply. That's a lie, Andrew protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I produced Gerald's will and the original deed showing the property had been left to him by his father. Gerald never knew about this place or its value. His father kept it from him, just as Andrew tried to keep it from me. I paused. By abandoning me here without transportation or adequate supplies, I might add. Jessica laughed nervously. That's absurd. We set Mom up with everything she needed. Frank chose that moment to knock and enter through the kitchen door. Morning, Blanche. Brought those groceries you asked for. He nodded to the assembled group. Folks. Thank you, Frank, I said warmly. Mr. Wilson has been kind enough to bring me supplies since I arrived, as I had no way to get to town myself. Frank's presence lent credibility to my claims. After he left, promising to return later, the atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted palpably. What exactly do you want, Mrs. Lawson? Brennan asked, his tone more respectful than before. First, I want acknowledgement that this property rightfully belongs to me as Gerald's widow. Second, I want a new transparent negotiation regarding any development or mining operations with proper compensation for the mineral rights. I looked directly at Andrew. And third, I want my son to explain why he thought it acceptable to abandon his mother in an isolated location after she just lost her husband of 40 years. Andrew's composure finally broke. What choice did I have? You wouldn't leave Boston. The deal had a timeline. Jessica and I needed that money for our new investment firm. Jessica shot him a warning look, but it was too late. So you decided to effectively imprison me here, hoping I'd die of neglect, sign away my rights out of desperation. I kept my voice steady, despite the pain his admission caused. Your grandmother suffered the same fate in this very house. Did that mean nothing to you when you read her journal? Andrew looked genuinely confused. What journal? I never found any journal. The real estate agent who found this place mentioned local rumors about gems on the property. I hired the geological survey team myself. I stared at him, processing this new information. If Andrew hadn't found Margaret's journal, how had he discovered the property's value? And if he hadn't read about his grandmother's imprisonment, did that make his similar treatment of me more or less monstrous? Brennan cleared his throat, interrupting my thoughts. Mrs. Lawson, regardless of how we arrived at this point, it seems clear we need to renegotiate terms. He glanced at his lawyers, who nodded. If you indeed hold legal title to this property, North Star would prefer to work directly with you. She doesn't have title, Jessica interjected. The deed is in Andrew's name. A deed that was fraudulently created. One of the lawyers spoke for the first time. If Mrs. Lawson can prove that, as it appears, any contract based on that deed is null and void. The meeting continued for another hour, with the lawyers reviewing documents and Brennan asking detailed questions about the property boundaries and mineral rights. Andrew and Jessica grew increasingly silent as it became clear their plan was unraveling. Finally, Brennan stood to leave. We'll need some time to review everything and consult with our full legal team. In the meantime, I suggest no one take any action regarding this property. He handed me his business card. I'll be in touch within the week, Mrs. Lawson. After the North Star contingent left, I faced Andrew and Jessica alone. The kitchen felt cavernous in the heavy silence. Why? I asked simply. Was money really worth more than my well-being? Andrew couldn't meet my eyes. Jessica answered instead, her voice cold. It was 40 million, not 10. Brennan was holding back the real offer until we secured clear title. The amount staggered me, but the callousness behind it hurt more. And that justified treating me like an inconvenient obstacle. We were going to come back, Andrew muttered. Once the deal was done, set you up somewhere nice. Like a pet being kennelled during vacation. I shook my head. You are not the son I raised. Your father would be ashamed. Andrew flinched as if I'd slapped him. You don't understand the pressure we're under. The firm is everything to us. We've mortgaged everything borrowed from Jessica's parents. Without this deal, we lose everything. And I was supposed to sacrifice my dignity, my safety for your business venture. I walked to the door and held it open. I think you should leave now. Mr. Brennan has my contact information if there's anything else to discuss. Jessica stormed out without another word. Andrew paused at the door. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't think it would be this bad. I thought you'd be comfortable here. I looked at him, this stranger wearing my son's face. You didn't think about me at all, Andrew. That's the problem. After they left, I sat on the porch steps and finally allowed myself to cry. Not just for the betrayal, but for the son I had lost long before this moment. For Gerald, who never knew his mother's full story. For Margaret, whose courage and foresight had ultimately saved me from sharing her fate. Frank found me there an hour later when he returned as promised. He didn't ask questions, just sat beside me in companionable silence until I was ready to talk. Rough meeting, he finally asked. I nodded, wiping my eyes. Family can hurt you worse than strangers ever could. True enough. He looked out at the overgrown fields. So what happens now? You heading back to Boston? The question caught me off guard. In all my planning for the confrontation, I hadn't thought much about what would come after. Boston held memories of Gerald, yes, but also of our life together. This place, for all its initial horror, held something else. Possibility, perhaps. I'm not sure, I answered honestly. I need to secure my legal position first. After that, I looked around at the property, seeing it with new eyes. Not as a prison, but as potential. Maybe there's something to build here. Frank nodded approvingly. Land's good. House has solid bones despite the neglect. Might be something to that. Over the next few weeks, events moved quickly. Brennan, eager to salvage some form of deal, offered to buy a portion of the property that contained the main sapphire deposits. His new offer, made directly to me with proper legal representation on my side, was considerably more generous than what he'd arranged with Andrew. After careful consideration and consultation with Gerald's former law partners, I accepted a modified proposal. I would sell the mineral rights to a 50-acre section at the far edge of the property, retaining ownership of the land itself, with environmental protections built into the contract. The house and remaining acreage would stay fully mine. The settlement amount was substantial enough to secure my financial future several times over. Andrew and Jessica received nothing, though I did agree not to pursue legal action against them for the fraudulent deed. When I called Andrew to inform him of my decision, his response surprised me. "I understand," he said quietly. "And Mom, I am sorry. I got caught up in the money and proving myself. It's no excuse." "No, it isn't," I agreed. "But it's a start. Jessica's left," he added after a pause. "Said she couldn't be with someone who'd failed so completely." I felt a complex mixture of sympathy and vindication. "I'm sorry to hear that. Are you—" His laugh was bitter. "You never liked her." "I never knew her," I corrected. "She never gave me the chance." We talked longer than we had in years. Not about forgiveness, it was too soon for that, but about consequences and choices, about the man Gerald had been, and the values he'd tried to instill, about Margaret, the grandmother Andrew had never known. "I'd like to read her journal someday," Andrew said before we hung up. "Learn about her life." "Someday," I agreed, not yet ready to share Margaret's private thoughts with the grandson who had unknowingly repeated history's cruelty. 6 months later, the old Lawson farmhouse was transformed. With the proceeds from the mineral rights deal, I hired local contractors to renovate the structure while maintaining its historic character. The sagging porch was rebuilt. The peeling siding replaced the ancient plumbing and electrical systems, completely modernized. Inside, original hardwood floors were uncovered and restored beneath layers of linoleum. Walls came down to create an open, light-filled living space. Frank, who had become both friend and informal project manager, introduced me to local artisans who crafted custom cabinets and furniture. "Never seen this old place looking so fine," he commented as we toured the completed renovation. "Margaret would be pleased." I had incorporated many elements honoring her throughout the house. Her portrait hung prominently in the living room. The jewelry from the hidden room was displayed in custom cases. I'd had her journals professionally bound and placed on a special shelf in the library we'd created from a former bedroom. Outside, I'd reclaimed the gardens, using Margaret's detailed plans, adding paths and benches for quiet contemplation. An orchard of apple and cherry trees was newly planted where the old one had once stood. The barn had been stabilized and converted into an art studio, where I had begun painting again for the first time in decades. During the renovation, I had stayed in a small apartment in the nearby town of Ennis. I grew to appreciate the close-knit community, so different from my Boston life, but welcoming in its own way. I joined the local historical society, fascinated by the area's rich past. I took fly fishing lessons from Frank and discovered a meditative pleasure in standing thigh-deep in the cold river, casting into rippling water. I maintained my Boston connections, visiting friends and tending to the brownstone, which I decided to keep rather than sell. But increasingly, the Montana property felt like home. Not the prison it had been intended to be, but a sanctuary of my own making. Andrew visited for the first time since our confrontation on a bright October day, the mountains dusted with early snow. He stood awkwardly on the new porch, uncertain of his welcome. "It looks amazing," he said, taking in the transformation. "Nothing like before." That was the idea. I held the door open. "Come in, see what your grandmother built in her way." I showed him through the house, pointing out Margaret's belongings now displayed with honor. In the library, I finally shared her journals with him, watching as he read her words with growing emotion. "I never knew," he said, closing the final volume. "Dad never spoke of her except to say she died when he was young." "He likely never knew the full story himself," I replied. "His father would have controlled the narrative." Andrew ran his fingers over the embossed cover. "I repeated history without even knowing it, tried to do to you what my grandfather did to her." I didn't contradict him. The parallel was undeniable, though I had escaped the fate Margaret suffered. "I've been seeing a therapist," Andrew continued, "trying to understand why I became someone who could do something so cruel to my own mother." It was the most honest he'd been about his actions, a start perhaps toward whatever our relationship might become in the future. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," I said, changing the subject. "My granddaughter." Andrew looked up in surprise. "Your what?" I smiled. "Not biologically, of course. Lily is Frank's granddaughter. She's 12 and incredibly talented. I've been teaching her to paint on Saturdays." I showed him photos of a serious-faced girl with a paint-smudged nose, proudly holding her first completed landscape. "She reminds me of you at that age. Determined, focused." Andrew's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't just rob you of your home and security. I robbed us both of years we could have spent together." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You did. But we're still here. That's something." That evening, Frank joined us for dinner on the porch, the autumn air crisp but pleasant beneath outdoor heaters. The conversation was sometimes stilted, but mostly cordial. Frank, with his straightforward manner, helped bridge the awkward moments. After Frank left and Andrew retired to the guest room, I sat alone watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. So different from Boston's light-polluted nights. I thought of Gerald, of how he would have loved this place if he'd known of its existence. I thought of Margaret, whose courage and foresight had saved me from her fate. I thought of my new community of Lily and her budding talent of Frank's steady friendship. The next morning I showed Andrew the art studio in the renovated barn. Canvases in various stages of completion lined the walls, landscapes of the property in different seasons, alongside abstract explorations of grief and renewal. "You're painting again," he observed. "I remember when I was little watching you in your studio at home." "I stopped after you left for college," I admitted. "Too busy with teaching, and then when I retired I'd lost the habit. Being here with all this light and space—" I gestured to the tall windows framing mountain views. "It woke something up again." "They're beautiful, Mom. The local gallery in town has asked to show some of them next spring," I said, allowing myself a moment of pride. We walked the property after breakfast, following paths I'd established through meadows and woods. I showed him the section I'd sold to North Star, now cordoned off for preliminary mining exploration. "They're being respectful of the land," I explained. "The contract requires minimal environmental impact and complete restoration afterward." At the property's edge stood a small stone marker I'd commissioned engraved with Margaret's name and the dates of her time here. "To honor her," I explained. "She wasn't just imprisoned here. She fought back in the ways available to her. She created a legacy that ultimately saved me." Andrew knelt beside the marker, brushing leaves from its surface. "I wish I'd known her." "She would have been disappointed in what you did," I said honestly. "But I think she would have understood the pressure to succeed at any cost. That was the world her husband lived in that your father insulated us from." We continued walking in silence, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. Near the house I'd established a memorial garden for Gerald as well, with his favorite flowers and a bench where I often sat to feel close to him. "I miss Dad," Andrew said as we paused there. He would have handled all of this so much better. Perhaps. I sat on the bench patting the space beside me. Or perhaps not. We all have our blind spots, our weaknesses. Gerald was no exception. As we sat together, a tentative peace between us, I knew the road to real reconciliation would be long. Trust once broken so profoundly doesn't mend easily. But sitting in the garden named for his father on land that held his grandmother's story, there was at least the possibility of a new chapter. I looked out at what had been intended as my prison, and had become my canvas instead. The renovated house gleaming in autumn sunlight, the studio where I created again, the gardens reclaimed from neglect, the community I'd found, and the purpose I'd rediscovered. Sometimes, I said, the worst intentions lead to unexpected blessings, not because of those intentions, but despite them. Andrew nodded slowly. I'm sorry it took such a terrible action on my part to bring you here. I'm not forgiving you yet, I told him honestly. But I'm open to the possibility someday. That's more than I could have said 6 months ago. As he prepared to leave the next day, Andrew asked hesitantly, Can I come back for Thanksgiving maybe? I considered it, weighing my own healing against the potential for rebuilding. Not Thanksgiving. It's too soon, and I've already invited Frank and Lily. I saw his disappointment and added, But Christmas perhaps. If you're willing to stay a few days, really get to know the place. And me as I am now. He nodded, understanding the terms. I'd like that. After his car disappeared down the drive, I returned to the studio and uncovered a canvas I'd been working on in private. A portrait of Margaret, based on the old photographs, surrounded by symbols of the legacy she'd left. Sapphire's journals, the keys to hidden rooms, both literal and figurative. Behind her stood the house, dark and forbidding on one side, transformed, and light-filled on the other. In Margaret's eyes, I'd painted a knowing resilience, the look of a woman who'd planted seeds she would never see bloom. Seeds that had generations later saved another woman from a similar fate. I picked up my brush and added a new figure to the canvas. Myself standing in the doorway of the transformed house, looking outward rather than in. Not imprisoned, but freed by the very place meant to confine me. Have you ever had a moment when betrayal unexpectedly led to discovery? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more tales of resilience and renewal. And if you know someone who might need to hear that second chances can come in the most unexpected packages, please share this video with them. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, sometimes our greatest strength emerges from our deepest wounds.